What's up YouTube? We're back with Project FXR, and this is going to be the second installment in this video series, and we are going to pick up where we left off on the last one. So if you watched the last video and you remember, this is our 93 FXR convertible, and we spent some time getting a bunch of stuff torn down and starting to dig in a little bit to just get a sense of what we needed to do so we could start building things back up. So today's video is going to be a couple different parts. We are going to be over on the primary side of the bike, and what we're going to be working on is trying to accomplish a few things. First is we're going to be changing out all the seals on that side of the transmission. Got about 4 or 5 of them over there we need to do. We are going to get our chain drive conversion sprocket installed, and we are also going to do the upgrade on the swing arm. We may get to putting the inner primary back on, but maybe not. We got some other things just trying to figure out right now, but for at least today, we know those 3 things we're going to get done. So if any of that stuff interests you, be it the seals, doing the chain conversion, or the upgrade to the swing arm, which is really cool, I think, stick around and we'll have some really good content for you today. So I'm going to do my best on this one to get a little bit more involved than some of the other kind of series videos we've done in the past. I want to get a little bit into some of the how-to just so you get some sense of some of the intricacies that might be involved in this, and if you've got any questions, hopefully being able to see it helps. There's a couple things that can trip you up on these bikes, particularly when you're in those years that kind of go, they make changes to certain parts. You're not sure which ones you've got. Hopefully we'll help to be able to identify that for you. So without anything else, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to move around to the other side of the bike and we'll get going with where we left off on that transmission. All right, so we're back over at the transmission, and to start today's project, which is going to be getting the new chain drive sprocket on here, as well as doing the swing arm upgrades, we're going to start by dealing with all the seals that we've got going on here that definitely, if you saw the mess in the previous video, all this stuff, most of it, whatever, it's probably leaking. Even if it's not, it's a good idea to change them as long as you got this far. So I actually went ahead and took one of the seals out already. This is a common one to change. This is your shifter shaft input. And this we had some play in, which it seems like is fine. We tried it again with a new shifter arm. Some weird wear on it though, which is why I wanted to look at it beforehand. So what you've got in that spot is, I'll show you kind of the pieces. There's a seal that lives in there, and then in front of it there's a washer and then a small snap ring that holds the washer in place. And this is interesting. I don't think I've seen this before. I'm going to try and get the camera to zoom in on this, but the face of the washer and the snap ring were actually worn away, and the snap ring embedded into the washer. And then what was left was this super micro thin snap ring that obviously needs to go away. But I'm just going to see if I can get this to focus, just because it's so interesting. Can you see it there? Yeah. So you can see kind of where the snap ring embedded itself into the washer. There we go. Kind of wild. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get the rest of these seals changed. I'll kind of show you the deal. Basically, there's a number of ways to remove these seals. None of them are super elegant. I've seen folks use a drill and put a little hole, and you get in with a pick behind it. What I find works pretty well is to just take an awl and be careful with it and start to hammer that in and kind of turn it and try and get the awl sort of so you can move the seal and kind of work it back and forth. Obviously, you don't want to press on the case or go all the way through and start marking up the inside of the bore where the seal sits, which we didn't do in this case. So you just have to be careful. If it's a little more stubborn, you might have to drill it in a couple of places and sort of pull on it. But we'll see how we do over here. I'll kind of show you how it goes. I'll reposition the camera a little bit so it's a little easier to see. But the first thing we're going to do is take this race off. Now, this is something that you could definitely do with your transmission sprocket in place. And that would be if you weren't doing all of this and you just needed to change this race. You'd get in there with this Jim's tool, and this puller slides behind the race. It fits inside that sprocket so that you can pull on it. It protects the shaft nicely. It's a good tool. If you're here and you're this far away, you got a lot more gap here. You could really get any bearing puller in back there, but we're going to use the Jim's one because that's what we've got. So I'll show you that, taking that off, a couple kind of things to call out there, and then we'll look at kind of the seals that are in here and making sure we get them all to replace. Get our new seals in, sprocket on, and then we'll move on to the swing arm and get going there. So I'll kind of reposition, and we'll go ahead and start by taking this race off. Okay, so in order to take this race off, like I said, we're going to use our Jim's tool here, and this just slides on. A couple of things to call out, instructions in the tool, just make sure that you set it up evenly. You want to make sure you're pulling straight on this bearing race. And the other thing we're going to do is make sure that we've got good lubrication on these threads. You can get a pretty good amount of pulling power on this, so you just want to make sure that you don't gall anything up. I've got a little bit of oil on here already, but I'll add a little more. Come on, there we go. So there's that. The other two call outs on this are you don't want to exceed 50 foot-pounds of torque pulling this off. If you need to do that, the recommendation is to heat this up and not more than 200 degrees. Now, that warning, I'm fairly certain probably has mostly to do with not melting the seals that are on here. Since we're taking them off anyway, it's probably less of a concern, but we'll still be mindful of not getting this too hot, because too hot is never good. So we'll start by just trying to take this off and just see what it feels like. I've got the socket just on a ratchet for now, but if it feels like it's pretty tight, I'll switch over to the torque wrench just to make sure we're not going to put too much on it. So we'll start just by tightening it up. And it does feel like it's pretty tight, which is not surprising. I mean, these things are pressed on, and there's a lot of activity there, so not totally surprising that it would be pretty tight to come off. There we go. All right. So once that pops free, that will slide off, and there you go. These are definitely a replace item. They get worn, they walk, lots of issues, can definitely cause a leak on that inner primary main seal. So we're gonna be replacing this with a one-piece bearing that you can do on these older 5-speeds. So this is going in the garbage, but we're just gonna put it aside for now. All right, so with that race out of the way, you can see your fifth gear seal, which is right behind it on the output shaft here. You've got your Sprocket Spacer here, as well as this big seal, oil seal here. Now, this spacer, in our case, I know it was loose because it was leaking so much, I saw it moving. So this is a part that can certainly go back in. In our case, however, we are going to change this to a different thickness in order to run the offset on the chain drive sprocket that we want in order to match up well with what we're trying to do in the back. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it. But so this piece for the moment is just going to go to the side. So now what we've got here is this big oil seal that's going to come out. There's another seal back behind it, and then you've got the fifth gear seal in here. So all this stuff is going to come out, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll just see how it goes. All right, there's one, just kind of didn't quite get the place I wanted, so it ripped the first couple times, but third time's the charm. Get that through. Like I said, don't hit anything back there. You'll regret that. So you'll see a little bit of transmission fluid coming out. Our transmission is drained. If yours is full, it's gonna leak more than this, but you can certainly do it with the transmission oil in there. You don't necessarily have to drain it all the way like we did. But go ahead and just wipe that up a little bit. Just a note, if you did take the option of drilling rather than using an awl or a punch, you want to make sure you get all the metal filings and stuff out of here. That's why I like to avoid using the drill if I can. Just a little bit less risk in that regard. Okay, so now we've got a quad seal here, and our fifth gear seal is still in place here. So the quad seal, I'm pretty sure I can just grab like that. Okay. So that comes out, real simple. And then the last one is the 5th gear seal here, which that one can be a little bit harder to get out, but I think we'll take the same approach. Just rather than using this awl, which is probably too big, we'll just get a little pick and see if I can get it out that way. All right. Well, that was about as bad as I've ever had one of those come out. Let's see if we can show you, take a look at that. Doesn't want to zoom, or focus, but this is all pretty ripped up, but it came out one piece. Basically what we're gonna do is just look carefully through here, make sure that the surface in here didn't get messed up at all, which looks totally fine. And we'll just give it a little cleaning and we'll be ready to go with our new seals and new spacer. All right, so now that we've got all of our old stuff out and everything's all cleaned up, we can go ahead and start to put our new seals in. Just a quick look at what we've got here. So this is the seal kit. We've got the big one that goes in here. This is gonna be for the inner primary. We're not gonna use that. We've got a different seal that's gonna come with that new one-piece bearing we've got. You've got your quad seal, you've got your 5th gear output shaft seal, you've got the starter jack shaft seal that also goes in the inner primary, and then we've got the shifter shaft seal. This did not come in this kit, just something that we had to get separately. There is also one more seal that comes in this kit, and that is going to be the O-ring that goes around the motor, between the inner primary and the motor. So that's our seal kit. So the first thing that we're going to do is get our quad seal here installed into its home back here. So what we're going to use is, I mean, you basically just need to lube all this stuff up. You can kind of use whatever you want. I like using assembly lube for just about everything, but you know, you could use grease or transmission fluid or whatever you wanted to. So we're going to go ahead and I'm just putting a little on here and just going to work this around. Okay. Just get that coated. Doesn't need to be dripping wet or anything like that. Just nice and slick, that's all. Okay. So with that ready to go ahead and place that here. All right, and just get it seated, and that's that. All right, so in this case, you don't need to tape off these splines or anything because the seal is actually a little bit bigger. There's a step up slightly when you get to the end, so that's where it sits. So you can just bring it over that. Just be careful not to, nick it or tear it or anything like that. So we'll just spin this around, just make sure it's seated in there. Okay. So the next thing is we have a replacement sprocket spacer. The original one is the same. This one is from Baker, but you could use whatever. One thing, it's just good practice to change this out when you change this main seal. And the reason for that is if you look at the old one, hopefully that'll focus, you can see there is actually some pretty significant wear marks in this. And obviously that comes from the spinning between this and the seal. And you want to obviously make sure that those aren't there when you change the seal so that you get a good seal and it doesn't leak. So I am going to put a little bit of assembly lube on the spacer just for good measure. And we'll go ahead and slide that into place. And the spacer, hopefully this is fairly obvious, but it's got a chamfer on one side, and that chamfer is going to go in towards the transmission, and that basically is there to lock that quad seal in place. So we're going to go ahead and take this and slide this in. Now, one thing to note, the thickness of this spacer matters in terms of measuring the offset of your sprocket. So you need to make sure that if you're changing this to a different size, whether you want to or it just happens based on what you bought, you factor that in when you're looking at the offset of your sprocket to make sure that you get it lined up properly with your rear sprocket. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So now, with that in place, I'm going to take a little bit more lube here, and I'm just going to run this around the outside edge of the case. And what we're doing here is just giving ourselves every opportunity for that larger oil seal to go in nice and smooth. So we do use special tools for a lot of stuff. In this particular case, there is a Jim's tool to put this main seal in. However, I don't have one because it's not something we do a ton on these 5-speeds. So it's not a super difficult seal to get in. If it was, I would get the tool, even if it wasn't something we used very often. Frequency is one thing, but difficulty is another to factor in if you're going to decide you want to buy a tool or not. So this is that seal. This is the same as the old one. Just in terms of talking about the spacer, there are differences in years in terms of the OD of this spacer and the thickness of it. You need to make sure you have the correct seal based on the ID here matching the OD there. The outer diameter of this seal is going to be the same for all these 5-speeds, I believe. So we'll take a little bit more lube and just go ahead and lube this seal up. All right. The true importance here is the inside of the seal. That's really where the sealing action is taking place and where you want to make sure that you get a great seal. The outside obviously, needs to seal as well, but the inside is really what's most important. So with that lubed up, I'm going to take this and get it started on our spacer. There we go. And then I'm going to start to push that into our case a little bit here. And it's like kind of going in. All right. So now what I'm going to do, got it started a little bit. I'm just going to take a little block of wood and a hammer and just give it some light taps, nothing crazy, to get this seated. Then you can come in and using a small drift. You want to be careful with this. Obviously, you don't want to damage the seal. But we can give this just some little taps just to make sure that the seal gets fully seated. Okay. So after you've kind of walked that around and you get a consistent feel, you just run your finger around. Obviously what you're looking for here is to make sure that this is fully and evenly seated in the case. So this feels perfect, so we are ready to move on. So we've got 2 seals done and we've got, looks like 2 more to go. So the next one we're gonna do is the 5th gear output seal. And this one, perhaps might be a little bit of a challenge without the right tools to do it. Obviously, it's another metal and rubber or neoprene or whatever that inside material is, seal, and this is going to have to get driven into this or pressed into this groove right here. And obviously, trying to knock it in, you're going to wind up having to use something that's a little bit, more of a fine point to it. You might damage the seal, so you don't want to do that. So what we do is use a special tool that's not quite meant for it, but we adapt it. So before I mentioned the Jim's tool we use to remove and install this old race for the inner primary, which we won't be using again. Like I said, we're using a 1-piece bearing. So that 1-piece bearing gets pressed into the case and into the primary case, and then is a slip fit onto here. So there is a tool to install this. Let me grab that. Okay. So basically, this tool will slide over, push this on, and then by attaching to the output shaft here, you'll drive down this collar and it will drive this into its place. Now, what we've done, obviously, in order to install this seal, we need that same mechanism. So take an old one of these and grind down the inside diameter. So instead of being a press fit, it becomes a slip fit on here, and this now becomes part of the tool. And this spacer, or this bearing race, I should say, becomes a perfect driver to perfectly seat that seal inside, around the output shaft and inside the outer shaft where it needs to be. So that is a pretty good trick, and it works really well. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this stuff set up. We're gonna lubricate the seal again, same as before. I am, in this case, gonna tape off this, the splines here, because we definitely don't want the seal dragging over these, and it will. So we're gonna get this taped off, we'll get everything lubricated, and I'll reset and we'll show you that seal going on. All right, so you can see we've got our seal started here. We've got the modified bearing race that I mentioned. Here's our GIMS tool. We're gonna hold the shaft here, tighten this down, and we're gonna set this seal inside. Now, obviously what we're doing here is seating a seal, not a bearing race. So we're not gonna mash this thing and destroy it. We're just gonna go until the seal is seated at the bottom of the bore. All right, feel that resistance changed, it's bottomed out, and we simply release the tension on the tool, put the wrenches down, back off our nut, slide the collar off, unthread the tool from the output shaft, remembering that these are left-handed threads. All right, and that tool will get wiped down and put away. So we're done with that. Now we can take our installer off. We've got our seal perfectly seated in there, and we're good to go. Okay, so to get our next seal in, we're gonna be working here on the shifter shaft, and the seal that's gonna go in there is this little guy. Now, this is another one that you can use a special tool on, or you can do it without it. In this particular case, I do prefer to use the special tool, and the reason for that is, I'll show it to you here. It's basically, you're just gonna hit it, and you've got a hole in here, and it slides on the end of the output shaft, or the shifter shaft, like that. The reason I like this is because it's stepped. So what this is gonna do is this is gonna give you the exact correct install depth for this seal. And this one is for a 5-speed. There's also a slightly different one for a 6-speed. So that, to me, the assurance of getting the seal exactly seated in a place where there's not a lot of room for error is a good idea. I would also say this is another one that's a little bit tight. There are a couple different versions of this seal. There are versions of it, and we've got some here too I could show you, I guess, that have the metal outside versus the hard neoprene here. I find that these go in a little bit easier, and they work just fine. So what we're gonna do here is lube this seal up, and we are definitely gonna tape off the splines on the output shaft on this one as well. So let me get some tape on there, we'll get this lubed up, and we'll get it installed. Okay, so you can see we've got our tape on here, it's all been lubricated, slid the seal on just to get it kind of started in the lip of the bore there, and then we're gonna take the install tool and just tap this gently and evenly into place. All right, so I pulled the tape off here just to make sure we could get the tool all the way on. I just wasn't seeing it get exactly seated where I wanted it to. And I feel like there's a little bit of unevenness here. I'm not totally satisfied with how this went in. I want to try one of the other seals just to see if maybe it fits a little bit better. Obviously, you know how these things are, you know, machining tolerances, whatever with Harley, not every part is exactly the same. So fitments, little differences. I'm just going to try one of the other seals and hopefully we can get it to seat a little bit better. So I'm going to do that right now, and we'll come back and see what it looks like. Okay, so here's that other seal. Obviously you can see it's more the same type of the one we used on the fifth gear seal. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in, obviously making sure we get the spring on the inside and the covered side on the outside. I'm going to put this on here. Nice and easy. Okay. I do like how this seal went in better than the other one though. It seems to be, I don't know, just a little bit, maybe just experience helps doing this enough times. That one just really felt like it went in really well. The rubber seal, not quite as much. So I know I said I prefer the rubber ones a lot of the times. There's a reason we've got both. Sometimes one just works better than the other. So we'll just get that triple checked and then we'll move on to getting our chain drive sprocket on and we'll talk a little bit about that. All right. So moving on to the install of our chain drive sprocket. This is, I think, probably the reason why a lot of people might be here in this place and be replacing these seals to begin with, is because they took everything apart because they wanted to do a chain drive on their FXR. A lot of what we're going to talk about here is applicable to a whole bunch of different bikes. The general theory applies. The specifics in terms of numbers and spacing are going to be different depending on the bike and transmission, rear wheel, all that stuff you have. But at least hopefully this will be helpful in terms of understanding kind of what you need to figure out. So obviously the whole thing here is that the motor and transmission are where they are and they're not going to move in the frame. And we need to then line the rear sprocket on the rear wheel up with wherever we put the front sprocket on the transmission, because those need to be right in line so the chain tracks straight. Simple enough, right? Okay. So the first piece in that equation is the spacer that we put in here, and understanding that these come in different thicknesses depending on the bike that you have, and they can be ordered to retrofit. If you have the early style and you want to move to the late style, you can do that, as I mentioned, just by changing this seal to the correct size. So basically what we're doing here is we know that we wanted to run a wider rear tire, which is the main reason we're doing the chain drive on this bike. These bikes come with a 130 tire and we're going to run a 150, which would be found on like a newer, not the newest dynos, but one generation back, the ones with the 16-inch wheels. So that's what we're going for. So basically what we've done is we're not trying to go crazy by pushing this whole thing way, way, way out and starting to get in the way of the frame or the swing arm or the shock or anything like that. So what we've got, and it's a very common setup, is we've got a sprocket from PBI that is a 3/4 inch offset. So when you combine, take this 3/4 inch offset and put it onto this spacer, which is the same thickness as it was before, the total difference in offset is a 1/2 inch from what it was. And the way we know that is, number one, PBI, this is on their website, but also comes with the sprockets, is a little chart showing you all the different sprockets they have that fit particular Harley transmissions, and showing you the spline thickness, the offset, total width, all that information so that you get the right one. And then they'll show you which tooth count options are available for which sprocket. For us, we did a 23-inch or 23 tooth count rather than 24, which would be closer to stock ratio with our 51 tooth rear. Went with the 23, mostly just because for the moment we're running kind of an anemic stock Evo, and just having a little bit more top end to be able to cruise the highway at a lower RPM would be nice. We may go back and change this when we update the motor, but for the time being, this one's going to work great. So what you need to figure out, like I said, is what your change in offset is going to be so that you can make sure that your rear is the same. So like I said, this is a 3/4 inch offset. If you go and measure your stock sprocket, you'll see that there's a 1/4 inch offset built into that. So the difference between 3/4 inches and a 1/4 inch is a 1/2 inch, and that's the thickness of the spacer we have for the rear. Now, this is all can be done just by the math of knowing what you've got, but the other thing is when you put it together, you just can check and eyeball it and make sure that everything is running and tracking straight and there's no binding or anything like that. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of figuring that out. The other thing, and I've seen people get tripped up over this, is there are some different spline thicknesses in these sprockets. You need to make sure that you get one that is the correct spline depth. There's not as many options as there are on the offsets, but basically needless to say, there are some that people wind up with buying by mistake that are too thin. And what happens is when you slide this on, and we'll just do that. There we go. You wind up having there be a space and the splines are sticking through, so that when you go to tighten down your nut, it doesn't actually tighten down on the sprocket. That is a huge problem. And somebody said, oh, so you could have some play in there. You absolutely cannot. That's bad. I heard another person suggest just getting a larger spacer. Again, not a good idea. If you have that length of spline and it's roughly 3/4 of an inch, 0.766 inches, that's the correct spline thickness. The other option is 1/2 inch. So basically you have just shy of a 1/4 inch or just more than a 1/4 inch of gap that you could put a spacer in there. Not a good idea. Just get the sprocket that has the right spline depth. So in any event, this sprocket is going to go on here exactly like this. Basically all that has to get done here to install this is to put the nut and lock plate back on. It is a very good idea. I think probably mentioned in the service manual, this should all be replaced when you do this. You don't want to put that old nut back on. It takes a lot of abuse going on and off. I mean, you saw what it took to get the old one off. The new install kit is super cheap, so just make sure you do that when you change the sprocket. So we're gonna go ahead and put this on, and we'll get moving on to the fun part of today, which is gonna be the swing arm. All right, and our sprocket is on. So obviously the lock ring just happened to line up with the two holes. If it didn't, just would have tightened it a little bit more to get it to line up, and just put in your set screws, and sprocket is on and good to go. All right, so one last thing to point out. Obviously, if we were going back to that original one-piece bearing and race, now would be the time to put that race back on and set it in the appropriate spot on the shaft here. This is the one-piece bearing that we're going to be using for the inner primary. These come from a couple different places. This one is from Jim's, but I just wanted to demonstrate here. This is just a slip fit onto the shaft. So it'll be pressed on the outer race into the inner primary, and so the whole thing will just go on as an assembly, and this will just sit where it needs to sit. And there's no worry about the seal because it's sized appropriately, and you got a nice seal around the outside. So that is then going to be that for this piece of it. So the only thing that's left that we need to do here, and you may have picked up on it, is we still need to put the washer and snap ring back on here. And I was a little bit concerned, if you remember from a little earlier, this sort of indentation that the snap ring had made into this washer. Also just a little strange about sort of this discoloration on the back side of it. Doing a little bit of research, I compared this to some other stuff we have. This washer is not correct for what's supposed to be here. It's too thick. So that could partially explain for why some weird stuff is happening here. So I don't have the correct thickness here. We're gonna get one from Harley. Just gotta run over to the Harley shop and grab one, and then we'll get that put back on here where it belongs, and then the snap ring in the groove to hold it in place. So we'll do that when we get it, not a big deal. But otherwise, we're pretty much set to go with the transmission here, and we're gonna move on to the swing arm. So there's our swing arm. We're gonna get this cleaned up, and we're gonna get these old bearings out, and we're gonna get the spherical bearings installed. So let's get some stuff put away here, and I'll meet you over at the workbench to talk more about the swing arm. Okay, so we've got our swing arm over here. Just wipe some of the crap off of it to get it a little cleaner to handle. And the first step that we're gonna take in getting our new spherical bearings installed is to get the old components out. So what you've got is a seal on each side, and then you've got a rubber and steel spacer on the inside. So that's gonna get pried out. And then you've got the cleave blocks inside, which are essentially a bushing as opposed to a bearing. And those are gonna need to be pressed out on the press. So we'll start by getting the stuff kind of pried off to get it out of the way. Then we'll go over to the press and we'll get this, get the cleave blocks out, get it all disassembled, cleaned up a little bit. Then we'll come back to the workbench and we'll talk a little bit about what came out and what's going in and why this is such a good upgrade to do for an FXR or an older FL model. So let me get started taking this apart, and we'll go from there. So those will come out. A little more aggressive than planned. All right, so then we can see in here, you probably can't see it, but in there, that outside diameter is what we're gonna press out from this side, and we're gonna do the same thing, pop this out, and then press out on the other side. So I'm gonna do that, and then we'll go over the press. I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so we've got the swing arm sitting in the press here, being supported a little bit by this 2x4, and then we got these two, just 1, 2, 3 blocks holding the outside edges of the bore where the bushing sits, that cleave block, I guess I should say. And we got a 1.25 inch socket with a long extension pushing through, and hopefully that is enough distance there for that to come out. If not, we'll have to reset, but at least just want to make sure this is going to work and we can push it out. You really should have there's a tool that you can use. It's basically the female side of a driver tool. It's a Harley tool. I don't have one. We've made it work this way before, so we'll just go for it. Right. There we go. So just take the swing arm out of here, get my socket disconnected. Oop. So this sort of has to come apart in a few pieces here. Oop. There we go. All right, so you can see hopefully that bore is empty now. That's the cleave block that came out of there. I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side, and we'll go back over to the workbench and look at what we got. All right, so we've got our bushings, cleave blocks pushed out of our swing arm, and we've got this inside of the swing arm all nice and clean. Just go at that, get off the rust and shit that's in there, degrease it, brake clean, whatever you need. Just get it nice and clean, free of any dirt. You can continue with the installation. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing exactly. So what came out of each side of the swing arm was essentially a big bushing. These have metal on the outside, a rubber or polyurethane type of material isolating it, and then it sits with this retaining ring inside the swing arm. So basically, it's a big bushing, right? You know, it's a cleave block, that's the technical name for it, but it's basically just a bushing. So this is gonna move in kind of every direction as that poly material flexes and twists. What we're replacing this with, and I'm just gonna clean my hands off a little bit after touching that old bushing, are these spherical bearings. So basically this is going to replace what was in there. And so hopefully what you can see here is that you've got basically, it's a big ball sitting inside of a race. And so this will move as it needs to allow the swing arm to move and be isolated from the rest of the bike. But it's going to eliminate a lot of that unwanted movement that you're going to get from the old bushings. So the bearing is definitely a nice upgrade and a really good way to take a stock swing arm and make it a whole lot better. This is one of those things where we talk about, you know, the FXR has really great bones, but there's things you need to do to bring it up to modern standards of performance and tech. This is one of them. So this kit comes from Custom Cycle Engineering, and it comes with or without a new pivot shaft. We elected to get one with the pivot shaft just because as long as we're replacing parts, might as well have it all be perfect. So this is all going to bolt in once we get those new bearings installed. So what you've got is a bearing for each side. You've got a bearing spacer that goes on each side, and then you will lock that down with the nut and spacer here provided. Some things that won't be reused, some of those, the seal and spacer we pulled out of the old swing arm, all that goes away. What is retained is the bushings for where it attaches to the frame. These are new, definitely highly recommended. Replace the ones you've got in there. These are super inexpensive to just replace while you're doing it. Not included in the kit, just get those from Drag or wherever. And then just capping it off with a set of Alloy Arts mounts to put on the outside. So this is just a nice dress-up detail. These are obviously stronger, better made than the, you know, just kind of stamped cast steel pieces. These are really nice. They look great too. These don't come with hardware, so we're just going to use get some ARP 12-point bolts to put in there. We're waiting on those right now. They should be here in a couple of days, so we'll get that all put together. But just kind of wanted to show you the whole thing as a package of kind of the entire upgrade that we're doing. That's basically it for right now. The other piece of the swing arm, obviously, you've got the spot where your axle goes, and we are going to replace the adjusters that came out of there. They're just that old sort of metal plate with a ball, with an open circle that sort of flops around inside, and you tighten it with a nut on the back. We're going to replace that with a much better, beefier billet part. Again, just waiting for that to arrive, but it's not really part of this because obviously those don't go back on until the wheel does, so we've got a little time for that. So what I'm going to do from here is just give everything a final wipe down, and we're going to get these spherical bearings pressed into your into the swing arm. One piece I didn't mention that comes with the kit is this is a press block. So basically this is what makes the entire installation super simple. You will use this to press the bearing into the swing arm, and this will set it at the correct height. If you're going to do this yourself, basically all you need is a press. Even an arbor press would do. We'll use the shop press, obviously. One thing to note, just make sure you pay attention to the instructions. You need to use red Loctite. They want you to let one side set up and then work the other side to make sure that you get it exactly set for your swing arm and your transmission. So I won't go through all the nitty gritty on that. You can follow along in the instructions if you decide you want to do one of these. But in any event, we're going to get going. I'm going to get one of these set up and we'll get it pressed in. Okay, just about ready to go. We've got some red Loctite inside the bore here as well as on the bearing, and we're going to use this cap to press this in. So just using that as a little bit of a guide. So I'm going to get this set in place. Good. And so we're just going to go ahead and send this home. We'll finish it up at the end by hand because obviously we don't want to go too much. Simply pull out the installer. Obviously you want to get that out before that red Loctite sets up. And now we've got one side of our bearing installed to the correct depth. So per the instructions, they want you to wait and let this side set up for 2 hours before you start doing the other side. So we're gonna go ahead and put this aside, and we'll come back when we're ready to start getting the other side installed. Okay, so we went ahead and waited the couple hours. It's actually the next day now for that red Loctite to set up on the one side of the swing arm for the bearing that we installed. And we went ahead and repeated that same process for the other side. And then before giving the Loctite a chance to set up that was on that second side that we did, we went ahead and fit the swing arm to the transmission. So the idea here is that plug that you're using as on the press to set your height, it's gonna get it, let's call it almost exactly correct. But the thing about this is with these bearings, if you think the way these spherical bearings work, is that if you don't have the gap set exactly correctly, these bearings are gonna bind. And if you think about that, it makes sense, right? If they're in too far, you're not gonna be able to get it around the transmission, right? So that's just not gonna work. If there's a gap, and by a gap I mean any gap at all, what's gonna happen is when you tighten down the pivot shaft, you're gonna side load the bearings and they're gonna bind. So it's just not gonna work. And you'll know because your swing arm won't fall down, it'll hang up. So what we did when we first put this in, and I'm sorry I didn't videotape this, I was just sort of working quickly and going back and forth. Basically what they tell you in the instructions is if it's a little bit too tight, you can kind of tap it and get it to move back. We didn't have a ton of success with that. Or if it's too loose, that when you go to tighten this pivot shaft down, it will pull in and correct that gap. I didn't find that to be the case. So basically what happened on this one, and in other times we've done it, it's been exactly right. But on this particular one, it took a little bit of work. Probably because these swing arms are not perfect, to be totally honest. I mean, if you had a billet aluminum machined swing arm, it'd probably be a different thing than a welded, cast, whatever, piece of steel. Basically, when we set it in, it was a little bit too tight. And I went ahead and the Loctite probably hadn't set up yet. It's a very tight fit on that press fit. I mean, I've heard others describe it as not that tight. It's pretty tight. So, we tried to, knock it a little bit. We did get a little bit of a gap, put it back on here, and the gap was, I'm talking maybe a 32nd of an inch. Really, really small. So thinking that when we tighten down the nuts on the pivot shaft, it would pull it in and suck it together. It did not. It just bound up. And maybe you could really wrench down on it and get it to do that. I just personally don't think that's a very good idea. So what we wound up doing was I just put a little bit of heat on the swing arm to loosen up that red Loctite, went back to the press, just pushed it down just ever so slightly, sort of splitting the difference between where it was totally bottomed out and where we had opened up that teeny little gap. Brought it back over here, and it was still a little bit tight on the swing arm, but it was just loose enough, or I should say it was only so tight that we were able to kind of knock the swing arm into place with a rubber mallet and just sort of work it on there and get it in place. Now at that point, your bearings are going to be a little bit side loaded coming from the inside out, but when you tighten down your pivot shaft and you bring that pressure in on the outside, you'll get it perfect. So the swing arm, you can see now, it moves perfectly. These bearings are 100% perfect. Before these were tightened, it didn't move quite so well. And as we tightened it down, the bearings loosened up, unlocked, and so we're good to go. So what you've got on here is the rubber isolators. So these are the old ones. There's a little index in here, which is gonna face out towards you, which is gonna align with the pin in your mounting block. So that's gonna go like that. They lock together. Obviously, if you do this and get it tightened down without these in place, you just need to make sure that the alignment hole is in the correct spot so that when you put this on, it will go on correctly. In our case, we're all good there, so you're able to just do this, and we'll put these on last. Now, obviously, we're still supporting the transmission and the motor with the jack under here, and we'll go ahead and put these on. These are the old ones. The bolts that come on the old ones won't work on the Alloy Art ones because the bolt holes are recessed and you wouldn't be able to get a wrench or a socket onto these. So you need to use like an ARP 12 point or like a cap head screw or like a button head, something like that. So I just, we've got some other hardware here, but I just figured we'll just order some ARP 12 points. So just put in order for those. They'll be here in a couple days and we'll get that put on. But for the time being, I'm just gonna reinstall these just so that we can get the jack out of here and just make sure everything's aligned and good to go. So I'm just gonna work on that a little bit. We're gonna get cleaned up and then we'll take a step back and see where we are in the progress. All right, so we got a good amount accomplished today on the projects we wanted to tackle on the Project FXR. Obviously, we did our transmission seals, we did our chain drive sprocket, and then we finished up with doing the spherical bearing upgrade in the swing arm. We've got it all back together now with just a little bit of buttoning up to do to get everything totally sealed up and fully back. We've obviously got our new shocks that are going to need to go on. That'll be happening pretty soon. We've got some work being done on the rear wheel. We'll get that back on. We get the fender back. We can start to get all of the electronics back there situated and maybe get the rear wheel back on kind of permanently. We've got the inner primary we've got to put together. And then a whole bunch of other stuff that we haven't even started yet. So I'm going to do my best to kind of try and do everything in order and keep the videos going as best as I can so that we don't miss anything on this project. And I think it'll be hopefully pretty helpful for people to see kind of going from, a bone stock FXR that you can kind of pick up to building something pretty radical and pretty high performance, but still keeping that really traditional FXR styling. So that's going to do it for today. And hopefully we'll see you next time. So until then, ride safe.